and I don't want it to last for 2 hours. So on this page, you'll have read while I was saying that the best thing is to look at the edges of the wings. What most of us do when we see a butterfly is to think first of all about what basic colour it is. Nothing wrong with that, but as soon as you can, look at the edges of the wings, because most of the detail that helps you separate species is there. And it helps you sometimes if you know what the butterfly's doing, if you can work out, is it simply flying sort of purposefully or purposelessly? Is it looking at flowers because it wants to feed? Is it looking for other butterflies because it wants to mate? Is it looking for leaves on which to lay eggs? These sorts of things help you determine if it's a male or a female, and they help you determine what to look for, because sometimes the males and females are different. Generally speaking, anything that's being fairly aggressive and appears to be looking for other insects is a male, and those which appear to be completely disinterested in other insects but very interested in the plants are a female. We're going to go into this by looking at each family group that we might encounter at this time of year and for the next month or so, by looking at the nymphalids. And as I've said here, you can sort of break them into two groups. You've got the tortoiseshell and comma, and possibly the painted lady, which look orange when they fly past you, or even when they settle at a distance from you. And then the peacock and the red admiral look much darker. So we'll look at the first three, the orangey ones, and we'll see that you can tell them apart quite easily, because the comma has got these very ragged edges. It looks as if something has torn bits out of it. And yellow lunules, these little triangular marks are called lunules. So yellow lunules. The tortoiseshell, far less jagged and with blue lunules. And the painted lady, like the tortoiseshell, less jagged and black wingtips with white spots in them, whereas the other two, of course, don't have that. This one's got what some people refer to as tiger stripes across here, but it hasn't got black and white dots in the wingtips. So the comma, jagged, small tortoiseshell, blue lunules, painted lady, black and white wingtips. The peacock, one of the two that appear very dark when they fly, is pretty easy, isn't it? Because it's that lovely red colour with the 4 obvious eyes. Red Admiral and Painted Lady are also pretty straightforward, because the Red Admiral is almost entirely black with red bands, which look a bit orange in some lights, but the same black and white wingtips look as the Painted Lady, intriguingly, and no surprise to learn that they are closely related. Underneath, the Red Admiral and the Painted Lady look quite similar in that they have stripes of colour on the forewing, on the leading edge, and they have eyes on the rear edge of the hind wing. I suppose that's the trailing edge in aircraft terms. But you'll notice that there's quite a difference in the ground colour. So the Red Admiral is much darker because it roosts and hides away when it's not active inside very dark crevices, hollow trees, holes in the side of a building and so on. Whereas the Painted Lady will roost usually on the floor on a sandy texture. Remember, they come from the desert regions of Africa, so they're used to roosting in areas that look like this sandy colour of their background. Red Admiral tends to get inside in the dark to help it stay camouflaged. Now, there's one other species that you could confuse with the nymphalids, the group we're looking at the moment, and it is related to them, and it's the speckled wood. It also looks quite dark, relatively browny orange, and you'll see it around the edges of woodland and sometimes in gardens if you've got a few trees about. It's a very beautiful butterfly, in my opinion, and it tends to settle and bask in the sun, showing these creamy spots, which are a very good clue that it's a speckled wood. So there's a fairly dark chocolate background with lots of creamy spots and eye spots on the hind wing. If it closes its wings, it looks a bit more like some of the other species, as we'll see in a moment. But one of the things you'll notice, and it's quite clear in this photo, is how you've got these veins which stand out prominently, giving a somewhat fluted appearance to the hind wing. So as I said, let's look at the undersides of these orangey coloured nymphalids. We've got to separate them. We've got very much the same ideas, actually. The very jagged appearance of the commas outline, the blue of the lunules, as they're called, on the edge of the tortoiseshell. The fact that the peacock doesn't really have either jagged edges or lunules obvious, and it has a very, well, that's not quite true. I was going to say a very straight line here separating a pale band from a dark band. It's not very straight, is it? But compared to the other two, which look similar to it, it is straighter. And then the speckled wood also has a darker band near the middle and a paler band, but it's this fluted appearance with these prominent veins and the fact that there are all the little eye spots which help you separate that one out. Right, we're moving on to the whites. Please do ask a question. If you suddenly think to yourself, well, I didn't understand why I thought those were different because I couldn't see it, please say so, because it's going to be very difficult for me to guess what people are struggling with. So I'm just going to plow on and hope you'll say if you get confused about anything. As it says here, if you see a white butterfly, I'm using that term loosely, and it's yellow, that's really very helpful. But if it is a white butterfly that is white, well, it's pretty much no help at all, really. You can't tell what the species is at all from the fact that it looks white. You can tell a little bit from their size, and that here gives you a clue as to how the size makes a difference. And the much bigger brimstone and large white are fairly obvious, but occasionally large whites and small whites can be the same size because there is a variation in the size of these butterflies. So let's look at them, and we'll start with the two yellow ones. They're easy to separate. The brimstone is a pale yellow, like a lemon, and it has these very pointy wingtips. The clouded yellow is a much darker yellow, more like an egg custard, and it has a much smoother outline. If we look at the whites, and these are quite often literally impossible to tell apart when they fly. If they stop, and unfortunately they don't stop all that often, but if they stop, they are easy to tell apart. And as the names helpfully imply, the small white is a little bit smaller and it has a small amount of grey at the wingtip. The large white is a little bit bigger and helpfully it has a large amount of black at the wingtips. So it might be that you see a relatively large butterfly fly past you. It's white, but you can see black wingtips. In that case, it will be large white, because the small white, you cannot see that the wingtips are black at all. Just can't see that. Unfortunately, you could see a large white, which has got such relatively pale wingtips because the colour has faded that you can't tell, to be honest, whether it's a large white or not. So some large whites, you can see this amount of black in flight, but it's hard to tell it on every large white. When they settle, it's easy. And notice how far the large white's black colour comes down. It comes to below this central point of the wing. The small white never makes it as far as this eye spot look. Now, all the whites show a difference between the male and the female. I said that and then suddenly thought to myself, not quite true of the wood white. But anyway, let's pretend it isn't true and we'll say that they're all different in that the male, in this case, the small white we're looking at, has a single black spot here and the female has several black spots. That is true for the small white, the large white and the green veined, that the male has a single spot and the female has several spots. So if we look at these, what do you reckon? Are these males or females? And it tells you very helpfully there that this is a female brimstone, which is much paler and can look white when it flies. This is a green vein white with lots of spots, so these are both female. If we look at the undersides, we should be able to work out which of these are which. So which one do you think, look at the three, which one do you think is the green veined white? Which one do you think is the large white? Remember, it's the one that shows the largest amount of black in the wingtips. And you should have worked out green vein white with, I would say grey, but anyway, they're called green veins. And the small white, where the top part of the hind wing is almost completely clear of grey scales, but the hind part of the hind wing, the lower part, has quite a few grey scales. The large white down here, look at this large amount of black which shows through, and black or grey scales all over the hind wing. So these three are actually fairly easy. As I said, if they stop, you can see how much black there is on the wingtips, whether the wings are open or shut normally, and you can see the grey scales on most green vein whites quite easily. The other white, which shows a really clear difference between male and female, is the orange tip. So this is the male, absolutely instantly identifiable with those orange tips, and this is the female. She and the male, let's go back, did you notice, have this checkered edge, and none of the other whites have a checkered edge. So I'll go back to them because I didn't point this out at the time. Let's go back. So the whites, look, just have a completely plain border. There's no hint of checkering, but here we've got the checkered edge. And it is just possible that you could confuse that checkering with what we get with the green veined white, but I hope you can see the green veined white, the wingtips are grayer rather than black and white, and you get these little triangles, chevrons of grey coming in along the veins. It's not the same pattern. Here we've got black and white against a black tip, and here we've got triangles, separate triangles of grey coming in on the green vein white. And again, this is a female. They're both females because it's got lots of spots. The female orange tip, even though she's a female, has a single spot on the forewing. Now there's one more white you could see in our area, the rarest of all these whites we're looking at. This one's actually in a slightly different family to the rest, but it's in the white group, and this is a wood white. You can usually tell them very easily because they fly with such a fluttery flight, look as if they don't know what they're doing and they don't know where they're trying to go. But when they settle, look how the grey is smudged across the veins. So with the green veined white, you remember that the grey goes along the veins from the middle by the body out to the edge, but here it goes across the wing, and there is an almost circular spot. The black spot here is almost circular. The wood white will never settle with its wings open unless it's a female telling a male to go away, because they open their wings to signal to males that they've already mated and they're not interested. Moving on, the small copper and duke. So there are quite a few orangey butterflies, but the very small ones, small and orange, are the small copper and the duke, belonging to groups related to the blues, and also the small heath. So let's look at them now. There are unfortunately also the possibility of confusion with the painted lady if you're not familiar with the size of these butterflies, which is a similar colour but quite a lot bigger, and a day-flying moth called the Burnet companion. We're going to look at that later. So the small copper, which I think is an absolutely wonderful butterfly, has a pattern which is not repeated in any other UK species. The forewing is mostly orange with some black, and the hind wing is mostly black with some orange. There is nothing else with an orange forewing and a black hind wing. But when it closes its wings, it does look a bit like the small heath. Notice, as it says in the text, that you've got this orange edge to the hind wing, whether the wings are open or closed. Now the small heath, which is this butterfly at the bottom now, does look superficially similar, doesn't it? But there is something about the small heath that stands out absolutely brilliantly, and you'll see this for certain in the field. There is this streak of a very pale colour that goes about halfway across the wing. So that streak will always be obvious with a small heath. Always. There's no such streak on a small copper. In fact, there's no other butterfly with a streak halfway across the wing. So this is unmistakable in some ways, although some people manage to think it's a meadow brown, which is odd because this is a small butterfly and the meadow brown is much bigger. The marsh fritillary and duke do look superficially similar. The duke is a very rare butterfly and it's only on about 8 sites maximum in our 3 counties, whereas the marsh fritillary is being released all over the place at the moment. Some of them are actually managing to breed and form little colonies in our area, and other marsh fritillaries pop up unexpectedly. So there's probably more sites in the Upper Thames branch with marsh fritillary at the minute, we think, because people are releasing them, hoping that they will set up breeding colonies. Now, they do look superficially similar, and if the marsh fritillary is quite worn, it will look more like the duke, because it will not have this fairly striking difference between bright orange and creamy colour separated by strong black lines. But one way you can tell marsh fritillary from duke, very, very dependably, looking at the wing edge, look at this rear edge where you've got these creamy coloured lunules on the hind wing, and the duke has nothing like that, they're bright orange. So a clear difference, and once again it's the wing edge that helps. The confusion species, once again, is burnet companion. So this is a day flying moth, I beg your pardon, the burnet companion, and when it flies it does look actually quite orange. The hind wing of the burnet companion here can be a slightly more orange colour, and these stripes on the forewing do look a bit like the stripes on the Duke of Burgundy. So that is one to be aware of, so that you don't make the mistake of thinking you've seen something like a duke when you've seen a burnet companion, which is a very widespread moth in our area. So we're going on to the browns now. Up until now, and I think probably for the next fortnight, the only browns that are going to be flying in our area are the speckled wood and small heath. We've already looked at the speckled wood and the small heath, but soon we're going to see a few more. We might see the meadow brown, and we might see the ringlet, possibly by the end of the second week of June. So it won't be very long, but the gatekeeper's a long way off because things are a bit late this year. The temperatures have been low. The amount of sunshine up until the last week or so has been low, so butterflies are flying a bit later than usual. And I don't think we're going to see anything more than perhaps meadow brown and ringlet in addition to the small heath and the speckled wood. So here we are with the ringlet, the meadow brown and the speckled wood. And as it says here, the meadow brown has a single black eye spot. So you should be able to look at the pictures and work out which one's the meadow brown. And the ringlet has got multiple eye spots, each one with its own creamy halo. Most of these eye spots are on the hind wing. So I'm hoping you've worked out which is which, and you should recognize this picture because we've already seen this species. So here's the ringlet with multiple eye spots and creamy halos. Here's the meadow brown with a single eye spot on each wing, each forewing, and the speckled wood with all these creamy blotches. The undersides, now once again you should be able to work it out from what we just said. Which one was it with a single eye spot? Meadow brown. Notice that the small heath has a single eye spot too, but it's got this streak which goes only halfway. The meadow brown has a streak, look, that goes all the way. The ringlet has multiple spots, each with a creamy halo, or a pale yellow halo. There we are, look. And the speckled wood with these veins that stand out to give it this pleated effect. And there is one more brown that one or two lucky people might see mid-June-ish, but probably no one will see it until very late June, and that's the marbled white. But it is so obviously different from the other browns, and I think different from the other whites, that it's not really something you'll confuse. It is possible that you could see this fleetingly, the underside of the marbled white, and mix it up with this, the underside of the green veined white. But rather like I was saying about the wood white, notice that here the stripes go across the veins. And here with the green veined white, this is a green veined white, the stripes go along the veins. Okay, the blues. This is a challenging group, but I'm hoping to make it easy. If you find what I'm about to say with these various things I'm going to introduce, ideas I'm going to introduce, and if you can hear my phone going in the background, I'm sorry, it's because I thought some people might have trouble logging in. So I needed to keep my phone on so I could check if people were asking for help. Anyway, 3 quick charts helping you to separate the blues. First of all, on size, the smallest is the small blue. The brown Argus is a little bit bigger, hardly any. The silver-studded blue is also small. The holly blue and the common blue are similar size. I think the common blue is slightly larger. The purple hair streak you are not going to see at this time of year, but that one's around about medium size. But the 2 biggest are the chalkhill and the Adonis. You're not going to see the chalkhill at this time of year either, but you might well see Adonis. So there are potentially 6 blues flying at the moment you could see. If the colour is really brilliant blue, really brilliant, it's an Adonis. But if it's a pale purpley blue, it's either a common blue or a holly blue. The other 2 that we're likely to see at the minute, the small blue and the brown Argus, both look silver, silvery blue, I think you might say. And the silver-studded blue you will only see if you're on heathland in Berkshire. We haven't got it anywhere else apart from the southeast corner of Berkshire. That looks very similar to pale purpley blue of common blue and holly blue, but it's quite a small butterfly. So its size and the colour looking slightly darker helps to separate it. So how are we going to work out what we're looking at? Well, it gets even more complicated, I'm afraid, because the females of some blue species are almost entirely brown, and the brown Argus, which is a blue butterfly, is brown. Male and female are brown, and the small blue is a sort of navy blue colour, almost slate grey. So I'm saying that we need to consider, first of all, when we see what we think is a blue butterfly, we need to work out, was it actually a blue, which is separated at the bottom of this chart, or a brown coloured blue butterfly? That might sound a bit strange to say that. But the first thing to work out is, are we looking at a brown Argus or a small blue? And I'm telling you that I think the best way to work out what it is if you don't see it settled, you see it fly and then you lose sight of it. If it was flying around kidney vetch, almost certainly a small blue. If it was slightly bigger, nearly as big as a common blue, and away from kidney vetch, then it's almost certainly a brown Argus, because they're much more common, far more widespread. The best way to separate these 2 brown looking butterflies is to hope they stop flying, because then if they do, you can get a good look. But if they don't, you could check the males that are flying nearby, because that might help you. Because if it's a blue male butterfly, you can work out what the brown female that goes with it and likely flying about in the same area was. But let's leave that for a minute and go on to just mention that a very pale blue is probably holly, especially if it's flying around bushes and trees, not flying around close to the ground. So a butterfly that spends more time flying around bushes above head height, or perhaps I should say between shoulder height and above head height, is going to be a holly. A butterfly that flies around very close to the ground and looks slightly purplier rather than pale blue is a common blue, and the extremely bright blue that almost always is seen flying very close to the ground is the Adonis. The one more thing that's worth mentioning here is that holly blue, unlike all the other butterflies in this group, the holly blue, both the male and the female are blue. So we're going to separate them according to the colours on their underside. So we've seen something that looks blue and it settles. If you can see no red, just white undersides. This one's sort of greyish, I agree, but anyway, let's call them white undersides. If it's just got black dashes, then it's a holly blue. These are both holly blue. If the butterfly opens its wings, and you've seen the white underside and then you see a blue upper side, it must be holly blue. No other species has that combination of a white underside with black speckles and a blue upper side. If it's this slate grey colour and the dashes of the holly blue are replaced by little black dots, each with a white circle around them, white halos, then it's a small blue. But this is almost always found very close to kidney vetch. It's also tiny, smaller than the holly blue, and extremely unlikely in gardens. So if you see a white butterfly, which looks blue when it opens its wings, it's a holly blue. If you see a white butterfly, apparently white on the underside, that opens its wings and it's slate grey, it's a small blue. If it keeps its wings resolutely shut, the small blue has these black spots with white circles around them, and the holly blue has black dashes and they are not circled with white. And the thing to notice, these two, there's no red anywhere, but all the other blues, without any exception, all the other members of the blue family have red on them somewhere. So let's look at the ones which have red on them. Some of them, as it says here, have got red on both surfaces, upper and under, but you do need to see both surfaces really to get a good idea of the blues that you're looking at. So here are two species where there's red on the upper side. This one is a female common blue. You can see there's some blue in it, but there's also a lot of brown and orange coloured. I'm calling it red for shorthand, but you could argue that's orange. I wouldn't disagree. But one of the things that helps us when we're looking at common blue is that there is always this beautifully clean white border. Nothing breaks that clean white border. This one's a brown argus. The male and the female look pretty much identical. They've got these fantastic bright red lunules, and the border, look, has got little black veins that protrude into it. So I like to alliterate. A common blue has clear borders. The brown argus, both the male and the female, have really strikingly red lunules on all four wings, and they've got black veins going through the white border. If we look at their undersides, the common blue on this side here, you can see there is still, look, this perfectly clean border, just white. You can see the red lunules. We can also see that there's a dot just here, close between this big so-called cell spot and the body. Whereas if we look at the brown argus on this side, there is a gap here. There's no spot at all. So that's one way of telling a common blue and brown argus apart. And the other way is that in addition to these black veins breaking through the white border in a brown argus, is these two spots, which are making something like a figure 8. Can you see that? In the common blue, the spots are in a much smoother arc. So I'm just going to highlight that arc. There, do we see that? This is a fairly smooth letter C. Could it be to help us remember this is a common blue? But here we've got these two spots, look, which makes something like an 8. So there are 3 ways to tell these apparently superficial butterflies apart. Another confusion for some people is that they see a very brightly coloured common blue and think it might be Adonis. But we have learnt, haven't we, that there is a completely clear border on a common blue. And hopefully the Adonis blue has black veins which are really obvious coming through the white border. And once you've seen a male Adonis blue, there is no doubt in your mind. If you ever see a butterfly and think that might be an Adonis blue, you're not sure, then it probably wasn't, because the colour is absolutely stunning. If we look at the underside, we've got exactly the same way of telling them apart. Look, common blue, completely clear border. There is no other blue butterfly apart from the silver studded, we'll look at that in a moment, with this completely clear border. And the Adonis with these black veins showing through. It's also a slightly different tone, isn't it? It's a slightly bluer grey colour on this forewing compared with a slightly sandy colour of the hindwing. This one is more browny or sandy coloured all over. So the Adonis always shows these veins unless something's taken a lump out the wing, and the common blue always has a clear border. So having listened to that, you should be able to tell me which butterflies we're looking at here. So I'm just going to give you a few moments to think. What did we say? The two on the left are the same species, and the two on the right the same species. Did you remember that the holly blue has no red and black dashes and a blue upper surface? The small blue, which looks very similar on the underside, has a navy grey coloured upper surface. What about this? What can we see in the borders? Can we see any veins coming through? Maybe there's a hint of them. But here, is that a smooth arc? Yes, it's a common blue. Now we've got a comparison of a silver studded blue. As I say, you're not likely to see these unless you're on a very few sites in southeast Berkshire. And this butterfly looks slightly smaller than the common blue, and as you can see, the blue is a darker colour. But it's also got these thick black, I don't know what you call them, really, submarginal lines, areas, just inside the white border. So it does have an appearance which is different from the common blue, but quite honestly, if you saw one of these, a silver-studded blue that was relatively worn, then it might be difficult to say for certain that it was a silver-studded blue and not a common blue. Helpfully, very helpfully, the undersides are quite different, because the underside of the silver-studded blue has this almost continuous line of red lunules. They sort of join up, and it's got these little dots, which I would say have blue scales. That's what is referred to as the silver stud. I think the reason it's called silver studded as opposed to blue studded is that people thought it made them sound slightly more exotic if they were named after a rare thing like silver than something which was fairly common like blue. But it's a very neat appearance. And here we've got two butterflies side by side, but different species, which you could conceivably confuse with a silver-studded blue. But you can see, if we look in this position, neither one of them has that little blue or silver spot. And then you've got to decide which of these two is the brown argus and which of these two is the common blue. And by now you'll have remembered, I hope, my alliteration that the common blue has a clear border. You'll probably remember the brown argus has a figure 8. So this one with veins through the border is obviously a brown argus. And this one with a clear border and a smooth arc is obviously a common blue. Always clear borders. Hair streaks. No one's interrupted me with a question yet. Either you've all been bamboozled or it's just that it's incredibly clear, so probably the former. Hair streaks are a pain to observe. They're incredibly good at not moving for 20 minutes. You get bored, move on before they do. But if you are going to look for hair streaks deliberately, I would definitely take binoculars And some people deliberately take telescopes because they often sit quite high up. And to get a sufficiently good view to work out which species you're looking at, a telescope can be helpful. One of them, which is definitely flying around at the minute, but coming to the end of its flight period, is the green hair streak. No problem with identifying this. There are green moths that fly around in the day, but there are no green moths which take this shape on settling. Typical butterfly pose, bright green with this sort of lovely orangey coloured edging. It is a green hair streak, and you'll find them all over the place right across our 3 counties, but they tend to be completely absent from farmland. So if you've got fairly intensive farmland with monocultures of wheat or beet or something, then you won't see green hair streak there. But anywhere where there's rough scrubby land, you could find green hair streak. The other 2 hair streaks, which will be coming onto the wing fairly soon, the black hair streak maybe even this coming weekend, but more likely 10 days to a fortnight from now, the black hair streak will be flying. And about another week later, the white letter hair streak will be flying. So by the second week in June, both of them will be flying in our area. They're very similar, but what you'll notice is that the white letter, it's unfortunate that it's called the white letter hair streak, has a solid black line, where the black hair streak has black blobs. So that's the most obvious difference between them. It is true that the white letter hair streak has this white W, and that's probably what the white letter was supposed to be, this white W. But that isn't really all that different from the shape you see on the black hair streak. So if you get a fleeting glimpse, just looking at that white line isn't really going to be enough to separate them. You need to try to see whether this black line is continuous or separated into lots of separate blobs. Both these butterflies are capable of sitting still for long periods, and even if they do settle somewhere where you can see a bit of them, they've got a very clever way of knowing that you need to see this edge of the hind wing sitting so that there is a leaf between you and them that obscures this crucial part. Very odd how often they can settle, so you can see the forewing and the head, but you can't quite see this bit because of the way they sit on a leaf above your head. But they're both beautiful butterflies, and they're both very rare. The white letter hair streak because it eats elm, which has died out in so many places, and the black hair streak very rare because it has a very specialized habitat of old, thick blackthorn scrub. Doesn't do so well in hedges, and it definitely doesn't do so well inside woodland, where the woodland has been allowed to get very overgrown and dark because it needs sunlight on the blackthorn that it lives in. Day-flying moths, let's verge off into that, but I'm not going to try and teach you lots of these because it's too difficult. As you probably know, there are far more day-flying moths than there are butterflies. So not only are there many, many more moths than butterflies, but there are many more day-flying moths, moths that will fly in the day, than there are butterfly species. But if we look at some of the commoner ones, the silver Y, which seems to be around in quite good numbers at the minute, is a migrant, identified by this, well, it's referred to as a Y shape there, which is silvery or white or slightly creamy coloured. The Burnet companion, we've seen that several times as a confusion species with others. The mint moth, as some people call it, also known as small purple and gold. And the common purple and gold, which is actually less common than the mint moth. Very similar looking, but very striking moth. Tiny, absolutely tiny, but striking. There's the hummingbird hawk moth, which I hope all of you have seen and enjoyed as it flies about zipping between the flowers. The small yellow underwing, which is perhaps one of the smallest, I don't know if it is the smallest, but one of the smallest of the macro moths. And the mother Shipton, which has this face of a witch on it. If you look here, you'll see her nose, her eye. This is her mouth with a sticky out chin. Nose, eye, mouth and chin. Mother Shipton. There's her face again. Mirror image on the other wing. So these all fly around in the day and you will see them quite commonly. I haven't actually seen more than one hummingbird hawk moth so far this year, but I've seen all the others several times already this year, so they're definitely about. There are day flying moths that look white. Now they're smaller by and large than the white butterflies we see. So you've got the common carpet with this blue part through here. It doesn't always show up quite so blue, but that's a really nice specimen, nice and fresh. The grass rivulet with a similar pattern, isn't it? The white plume with this striking shape, as if it was crucified or a cross shape. And the treble bar, which is sufficiently large that you might think it's an incredibly small white butterfly. The treble bar has two forms actually, the treble bar and lesser treble bar, which are very, very difficult to tell apart. The males have slightly different shaped rears to their abdomens. The genital bits at the end are slightly different shapes, which you can help to tell the two species apart. And the angle here is helpful, but apparently not completely separable. You can't completely with absolute accuracy separate them by this angle, but it's helpful. And then there are some sandy looking, as I've referred to them, so they don't look quite orange enough to call them orange. They look yellowish when they fly, but more sandy coloured. The shaded broadbar, the common heath, which is very pretty, isn't it? And the yellow shell, which comes in a variety of shades, but again, very pretty. And then there are green day flying moths, but as I said, they're nothing like the shape of a butterfly. They don't, when they settle, you don't think, oh, there's a butterfly. You think, oh, it's a moth, but it's very pretty, like the small emerald, the green carpet, and the forester. Now, the forester and small emerald are probably not flying yet, but they will be very soon. This, by the way, the forester is a particularly iridescent green, beautiful moth. Skippers. A lot of people think skippers could well be moths because they're about the same size as some of those day flying moths, and they're very difficult to get a good look at because they zip about and hard to spot if they are very active. But the ones that we see in the spring, and they're still around, the grizzled and dingy skipper, look rather grey or dark brown in flight, but the ones which are coming onto the wing in June, the summer skippers, are a sandy colour. Perhaps orange, you might say, but I'd say sandy, really. So here are the two spring species. This one, when it flies, looks grey and white, very dark grey and white, or black and white. But if you get a good look at it, or if you get a photo that you can enlarge, you'll see that it isn't really quite as dark as it appears. It's got this fairly dark chocolate colour with a slight reddish tinge, but a very attractive butterfly. And this is the underside showing bands of white. Here's the dingy skipper, which can be quite variable. It can look greyish with very white areas here, or it can look quite dark. So this is more variable than the grizzle, but I think it's fairly easily separated from it because of these two dark bands that go across it, whereas the grizzled skipper looks more as if it's got white spots. This one looks as if it's got dark bands. Both of them tend to fly about very rapidly, very close to the ground. If you scare one away and you stand still, there's a very good chance it will come back to very close to where it was when you scared it, because they are territorial. The skipper here, the grizzled skipper, roosting, sits like you'd expect a butterfly to roost, but the dingy skipper, this one is roosting. It folds itself what we would consider to be inside out for most butterflies and sits more like a moth on a flower head like this, where they are actually surprisingly well camouflaged. Now there are some moths that look like them. We've already seen both these moths, but can you spot the moth? Do you know which of these four pictures is a moth? So I'm hoping that this confusion species that looks quite a lot like the grizzled skipper when it flies, but when it settles, you'd realise that that one was a mother Shipton. There's the witch's face. And of these two, I hope you've worked out which one is the moth, because this, the Burnet companion, is one we've seen several times, but they do look superficially similar, don't they? Now, The first of the summer skippers to fly about is the large skipper, which looks really quite orange. And the name large skipper is totally misleading. It's tiny. I'd like you to notice while you're looking at the large skipper with its paler orange spots in this broad dark band, very broad dark band there, that the large skipper has pointy antennae. Can you see these pointy tips? I'll be referring to them again later, but they're not quite so obvious in the later slide. There is a skipper which looks very similar to the large skipper and flies in our area, but not until late August. Well, that's not true. Not until August for most of us, and it's much scarcer than the large skipper. You are relatively unlikely to see it unless you go to the sites where it's well known, and that's the silver spotted skipper. They are very similar looking, and some female large skippers do look quite pale, so they can give the appearance of being this much paler silver spotted skipper, but there is a real difference in the underside because, yes, worth saying that the large skipper, when you see it early in the summer, when you see your first ones in June, you'll think it zips about and looks like quite a strong flying butterfly. But if you later see a silver spotted skipper in August, you'll realize it flies with much more purpose, much more vigor, very, very strong flying. But one way of separating these two butterflies, this is the large skipper on the left and the silver spotted on the right, is that you've got these three spots just here on a silver spotted skipper, and there's nothing like that on the large skipper. Sometimes these spots on the outer edge of the hind wing of a large skipper can look quite pale, and you might think, oh, could that be a silver spotted skipper? But you're looking in the wrong place. This is where you need to confirm silver spotted skipper, those spots just there, three white spots or silver spots. But you won't see a silver spotted skipper until late summer. Now, a little bit after the large skippers start to fly, the small skipper starts to fly, and it looks almost identical to the large skipper when it zips around. When it settles, though, you'll see that it's got no pale patches, and instead of having a very broad dark band across the edge here, let's go back to the large skipper, see the broad band there? It's got a relatively narrow and actually darker band. And the small skipper, if you see a male, has this curved, slightly S-shaped, S for small skipper no doubt, slightly S-shaped black mark, which is a scent scale. These cells here in this black area release a scent that allows the small skipper to signal to a female small skipper that this is a male and he's willing to mate if she is. Another skipper you'll see at the same time, possibly in the same field or the same spot, is the Essex skipper. It looks superficially really similar, but there's a difference. I hope you can see this is a very straight scent bar. Luckily, there's also another way, because that's a bit difficult, isn't it? You can tell that if you were looking at these things under normal circumstances, you wouldn't have such an enlarged view as you've got here, where I've taken pictures and then blown them up so that we can see this detail. So most of us standing a meter from them as they sit on a flower or on the ground, we're going to have trouble to see this, but there's something else you can look for that's a little bit easier, not easy, but a little bit easier. The small skipper, the tip of antenna is usually orange or brown, and there's a gradual change as you come along the antennal shaft. It gets gradually darker towards the tip. The Essex skipper, you've got to be looking from underneath the antenna. The antenna's pretty much uniformly orange all the way along, and then suddenly it turns to black at the tips. Okay, so the end of the underside, not the top side, the end of the underside of the antenna separates these two species extremely well. If you can't see the underside of the antenna, and obviously quite often you won't, then you can't really be sure whether it's a small skipper or an Essex skipper, because it's just too difficult. And that's something we have to accept. You won't always be able to identify every one of them. And I put here, the large skipper also has black tips like this, but with points. So let's look, can we see it there? I don't know if it's so obvious, that's why I pointed it out. Oh dear, pun not intended. That's why I drew to your attention that there were pointy tips on a large skipper. This one's pointing straight towards us, so it isn't visible. But it has black tips, but they're pointy. And it also has these creamy spots, which just show on the orangey green background. The small and the Essex skipper are completely plain. No hint of any spots at all. Right, we're very near at the end now, folks. I think we've just got these two species to go. Purple Emperor and White Admiral. Of the two, the White Admiral flies first, but usually not till late June. And the Purple Emperor flies slightly later, right at the end of June and the beginning of July. Of the two, which look very similar when you see them flying against the sky, because they just look black and white, the Purple Emperor is bigger and flies with a much more determined flight. The Purple Emperor will fly around in the treetops, and it looks as if it's going from tree to tree purposefully, and it doesn't, unless it spots something it wants to chase, turn round and come back. It keeps going in one direction by and large. The White Admiral has a completely different way of moving around. The males have a territory which they patrol, and they will fly backwards and forwards along a ride, and they do a handbrake turn. So they fly and glide down the ride, then they do a handbrake turn, fly and glide back, do a handbrake turn, fly and glide again. So you can tell them apart by their behavior. Purple Emperor usually is flying higher, not always. It can glide, and it will glide to come down towards the ground. And the Purple Emperor will be more likely to sit literally on the ground than a White Admiral. A White Admiral is more likely to sit on a flower than a Purple Emperor. Unfortunately, none of these rules is hard and fast, and you can find White Admirals on the ground, and you can find Purple Emperors sitting on flowers, but they don't often. If you get a good view because they settle, even if it's a female Purple Emperor which does not have this purple sheen, look for these eyes. The Purple Emperor has eyes. That alliteration thing again. There are no eyes on a White Admiral. There are some spots, but no eyes. Even on the underside, this rule works. There are no eyes on a White Admiral, but there are on the underside of a Purple Emperor, there are two eyes on each side. So look for the eyes, but you could also look at the shape of this white streak across here on the Purple Emperor with a tooth on it, whereas the White Admiral is a much smoother edge. So there are some quite considerable differences between these two. But for all that, because they tend to spend so much time flying fairly high up and usually at a distance from you, it can be a bit difficult to work out which is which. When you get used to the size of them, you can definitely tell the female Purple Emperor from the White Admiral because she's huge. Just size alone tells you. But they are a bit tricky if you only see a male Purple Emperor against the light high up. Very hard to tell if in fact it might have been a White Admiral. Okay, if all of you have been out there observing and separating your butterflies into the different species with confidence, you'll want to record them. So I definitely recommend, if you haven't already, you put this app on your phone, I Record Butterflies. I'm not going to go through it all now, just to say that some people have trouble finding out how to record a list of species in a single site, and it's this green button here. If you simply tap it, it will allow you to make a recording of a single species at that site. and then you'd have to tap it again for the next species and so on, which is a bit irritating because each time you'd have to write in the name of the site where you saw it. But if you hold this button down for about 2 seconds before you release it, when I say hold it down, it's on a touch screen, so you're not actually pushing it down at all. But if you put your finger on it for a couple of seconds, it will then give you the choice to make a species list. And then you can write all the butterflies that you've seen on that one site into a single list. And the beauty of this program is that it positions you with GPS, fills in the date and all that sort of thing. And if you need it, it's got this guide that tells you, if you're thinking, which blue was it I've just seen, you can check because you've got all this information. This just happens to be this advert for their app, happens to be looking at the orange tip, but it could equally well be any of the butterflies. There's masses of information about them. And the other brilliant thing about this is if you choose to use this, make a list of species at a site, it will tell you what it expects you to see there based on previous records, and it's very accurate. If you don't like using phone apps, and some people don't, then you can record on a computer using this thing, the butterflies for the new millennium. You can search on butterfly conservation or by putting in recording butterflies for the new millennium into a search engine. And both the previous app and this, you can go in and explore not only your own records, but all the records that anyone has made, provided they've not made them secret so that other people can't see them because they've seen something incredibly rare and they don't want people coming and walking all over the flowers where there's a rare butterfly to try and get pictures. And as you'll notice at the very end, you can download copies of what you've seen. So you can put all this stuff in there, and then if you want to keep printed copies or just to download copies and keep them separately in your own hard drive, you can get them back quite easily. If you record more than just butterflies, I hope you will, I hope you'll record moths as well. The moths is possible to record the macro moths, the bigger moths, along with the iRecord butterfly app I showed you first. But you can record all sorts of things on iRecord. This just happens to be damselflies, but it could equally well be beetles or diptera, crane flies. It could be anything. So you can record everything with the iRecord app. Ignore that. And then thank you for listening. I haven't had a single question as I've been going through, but I'm more than willing to take some now if anyone's managed to stay awake right till the end. And just one last point. Myself and the Parks Trust are doing all this out of the goodness of our hearts, you might say. But if you felt you wanted to make any donations to us, we'd be very happy to receive them. There's absolutely no pressure. And if you don't feel like it, that's absolutely fine. We really don't mind. But some people actually wonder what they're going to do with their money. So here's a suggestion. Give it to us. Thank you very much.